Good evening. It's time for our Wednesday Bible study to begin. Glad with those that are here. Just a couple of things to cover before we get into Leviticus chapter 11. Leviticus chapter 11 is where we'll be at this evening. For those that are members here at Antioch, there will not be any in-person worship offered at the building until at least October 18th right now because of the amount of COVID going around and just getting kids back in school and some of the things we're seeing. So we're going to play safe for those that are members and ask that we just go to that way, and we'll keep you updated as we move forward. Before we begin our study of Leviticus 11, let's go to God in prayer. Our God and Father in heaven, we come to thee thankful for the day we've had, for this time now that we can open your word and study from it. We ask, Father, as we look at those things that you have revealed, that we might find those lessons and meanings and that comfort and guidance that you give, that we might be more holy, that we might be more pleasing, that if we at all can, we will correct our lives no matter what to follow you. We ask your continued blessings on the world and on those with the virus especially, that if it be your will that they will retain their health and that normalcy will return. Father, we ask comfort as it can come from you if men will but look, that during this time of unrest and now heading into an election, that men will look to you for the guidance in the way that we ought to go, and that men will come to peace as it comes through you. We ask all these things through your Son, who gave his life that we might have that hope of eternal life. Amen. And all of a sudden, my drainage has decided to act up. So if I mute and turn the camera off for a moment, it means I'm having a big cough spell, and I don't want to subject you to that. But I think we'll be able to get through what's here. Leviticus chapter 11. We've been looking at Leviticus, and you go chapters 1 through about 7, and you have all the rules around the actual sacrifices, how they're to be performed, what else goes with them. In chapter 8 and 9, you have the consecration, the setting up of the priesthood. Chapter 10, you have that first departure and God showing that the little things that he commands really do matter. As we come to chapter 11, men often think that Leviticus is written to the Levites, to the priest. And yes, there's a large portion that was, but as we've already seen in the offerings, there was a part that the offerer, the regular, everyday Israelite had to do. When we get to chapter 11, God gives what is a very general rule. It has to do with what is clean and unclean in terms of animals, which is part of the Israelite diet then. But what is clean and unclean in those animals, and it applies to every Israelite, whether they're a priest, a Levite, or of some other tribe even. So we begin to see that. Let's read verses 1 through 8 of chapter 11. Verses 1 through 8. And the Lord spake unto Moses and to Aaron, saying unto them, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, These are the beasts which ye shall eat among all beasts that are on the earth. Whatsoever parteth the hoof, and is cloven-footed, and cheweth cud among the beasts, that shall ye eat. Nevertheless, these shall ye not eat of them that chew the cud, or of them that divide the hoof, as the camel, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean unto you. And the coney, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean to you. And the hare, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean unto you. And the swine, though he divide the hoof and be cloven-footed, yet he cheweth not the cud, and he is unclean to you. Of their flesh shall ye not eat, and their carcass shall ye not touch. They are unclean to you. As we Think about chapter 11 now. We see it open the way much of the other has. God addresses the situation. This is God speaking to man. And in this case, you notice he's not only talking to Moses, but he calls Aaron. So we see God speaking to the civil and the spiritual, the leader of the nation, as well as the high priest of the nation. He gives them instruction that is to go to all of the children of Israel. You notice verse 2, without doubt goes to all of them when it says, speak unto the children of Israel, saying. And it talks then about the animals that are under discussion. When it uses the term beast, that helps us to know he's really talking about the four-footed animals. That's what the Hebrew word is that's translated beast. It points to four-footed animals. So this is not talking about birds. It's not talking about the reptiles or the fish, which is pretty clear at this point, but talking about four-footed animals. You see verse 3, he gives some very basic criteria. Whatsoever parteth the hoof and is cloven-footed. So the first thing it had to have, does it have hooves? Are those hooves cloven-footed? Is it divided? The next thing he gives, and cheweth the cud. Does it have hooves? Is it cloven-footed with those hooves? Does it chew the cud? If an animal doesn't meet those, you could look at it as three requirements: having a hoof, cloven-footed, and chewing the cud. If it doesn't meet that criteria, it's unclean for food. Deuteronomy 14:6 restates this when it says, and every beast that parteth the hoof, and cleaveth the cleft into two claws, and cheweth the cud among beasts, that shall ye eat. And so God gives some very specific criteria here in verse 3 about what is clean, what is unclean. And if you think about it, this doesn't, we'll talk about it a little more probably on Sunday. We'll ask some questions about these things, but just as a highlight of it right here, God does not spend time thinking what man's going to do in the far future, and he doesn't begin to say this species, that species, this kind of animal, that kind of animal. God says you can look at the animal, and if the animal has a hoof and is cloven-footed and chews the cud, that animal is clean. If that animal doesn't do those three things, the animal is unclean. And so God's not spending time trying to say this, that, the other, like man will try to do. And we'll, like I said, address some of those questions a little further along. Because man has a great tendency to try to put his own wants, desires, and beliefs and make God fit it, when God's saying, here is my rule. And he gives them very specific. Then he goes on giving some more information. Verse 4, he begins to make the first of three animals that are listed here, the first one being the camel. Verse 4, he says, nevertheless, these shall ye not eat of them that chew the cud, or of them that divide the hoof, is the camel. Because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he's unclean unto you. God pointing to those three items and saying, it's not as long as it meets any one of the three, or even two of the three, it's all three or none. And so he says, the camel, you don't do it. Why? Because, well, he doesn't chew, or he doesn't divide the hoof. He's not cloven-footed. And so you see the idea there. Verses 5 and 6 now, he gives, it's listed as two, but for our part, we can call it really one. This is the coney or hare. The coney is a rabbit-sized furry animal, often called maybe a rock badger, or in the Syrian, the hyrax. But it's more like a rabbit. And then verse 6, of course, the hare there is the rabbit. Notice what God says. And the coney, because he cheweth the cud, But divideth not the hoof, he is unclean to you. And we'll address some of this later on when you think about the hair in verse 6, and the hair because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean to you. There will be people that begin to question this and say, but the hare, the rabbit, doesn't actually chew the cud. Well, God again is addressing these people and saying, as you're looking, if it looks like it chews the cud, but it isn't cloven-footed, don't eat it. That's the hare's problem. He doesn't divide the hoof. He looks like he chews the cud, and we'll talk some more about that later on, but he's not dividing the hoof. Therefore, the rabbit is unclean. You look into verse 7 now. Verse 7 talks about the pig or the swine. Now, this becomes one of the most detested animals among the Jews. What's really strange is at this point, God's using this to begin separating Israel, making it different from the nations round about it. And yet, what do those very nations that are round about Israel now call and not eat? Israel was so good at this that it influenced the other nations to take on these dietary restrictions. Think about that for a moment on how Christians ought to be in the world. We ought to be getting the world to take on the habits and the things Christians do, not vice versa. And here's a grand example. You go into most Arabic nations, and they follow these dietary restrictions that were originally put out by God. And one of their purposes was to set the nation of Israel apart from the other nations. And so we see a picture here. But notice the swine in verse 7. And the swine, though he divide the hoof, so he's got the divided hoof, and even though he's cloven-footed, but he chews not the cud. So he meets 2 out of the 3. He's still unclean. It's a 3 or none. That's how God set it up. You see God getting so serious about it. He says, of their flesh shall ye not eat, and their carcass shall ye not touch. They are unclean, unclean unto you. Think about some of the significance of the criteria so far. And we'll keep this thought going as we go through the rest of the chapter. But the first part, there are men who want to claim that this is for arbitrary, and we'll put arbitrary in quotes for this reason, arbitrary reasons. Well, God's reasons for him setting up the clean and the unclean criteria are beyond the grasp of man thinking, and thus apparently arbitrary. And even if it is, he is the creator of the universe and has every right to do so. Just like when you go to someone's house, they have the right to create, as we would see it, arbitrary rules. Why? It's their house. This is God. God can set this rule up. At the same time, they're really not arbitrary. God has a reason and a purpose. And so we really need to look at it. There is some hygienic reason to some of this. For example, the swine. They are known to be a scavenger kind of animal. They eat whatever scraps are thrown to them. And for the longest time, now in modern times when God has released that dietary restriction and we know to cook it well, and we feed the animal and raise them specifically for food, it's not such a big matter. But at this time, you had a hygienic reason. There were reasons beyond God saying don't, and God establishing that holiness and not unholy, clean and unclean. There were reasons for hygienic reasons on a number of these. A third one is anti-idolatrous reasons. Many of the unclean animals were associated with pagan religions. Therefore, God set aside and said, don't eat those. That's all not actually absolute. The only reason, there's just a piece there. Because if the animals was unclean based only on their use in pagan worship, well, then you would have to mark the bull as unclean, but he's considered clean. You would have to mark the sheep or the goat as unclean, but they're considered clean. And so that the method there doesn't do it. There may be part of it there for separative reasons. Now, this is the biggest one. God's dietary law for Israel was there to emphasize that his people were to be holy or set apart. They were to be different than the rest of the world. And so this was given to get the Israelites to be different with those dietary laws. When we think about why God might do something. Continuing on now, we've looked at the base of the four-footed animals, and that means it has to have a part at the hoof, it has to be cloven-footed, and it has to chew the cud to be a clean animal of the four-footeds. Beginning at verse 9, going through verse 12, we begin to talk about the fish and other water creatures. And notice what God says here. These shall ye eat of all that are in the waters, whatsoever hath fins and scales in the waters, in the seas and in the rivers, them shall ye eat. And all that have not fins nor scales in the seas and in the rivers, of all that move in the waters, and of any living thing which is in the waters, they shall be an abomination unto you. They shall be even an abomination unto you. You shall not eat of their flesh, but you shall have their carcasses in abomination. Whatsoever hath no fins nor scales in the waters, that shall be an abomination unto you. Well, think about this. This excluded some of a well-known and now considered, even in some places, the high kind of food, a delicacy. You would exclude lobster, shrimp. There were things like the sharks and the rays that would be excluded from this. And so you see the idea that God gave really simple description here. If it doesn't have fins, and there's no shrimp that has fins, no lobster that has fins, no crab that has fins, you don't eat those. And it has to have scales. And so therefore, even though it might look a lot like a fish, a shark has really no scales, and so therefore he's unclean. The fish that has scales and fins, those are clean and you could eat it. And so we see that picture there. Beginning in verse 13 and going through verse 19, we have really the birds. Look at how God begins to describe what is clean and unclean here. And these are they which ye shall have an abomination among the fowls. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. The eagle, the ossifrage, and the osprey, and the vulture, and the kite after his kind, every raven after his kind, and the owl, and the nighthawk, and the cuckoo, and the hawk after his kind, and the little owl, and the cormorant, and the great owl, and the swan, and the pelican, and the gier eagle, and stork, the heron after her kind, and the lapwing, and the bat. These are the things you will not eat. Some of these are difficult to attain the direct absolute meaning of what bird is he talking to, but the eagle is generally considered to be the griffon vulture, a large bird known for its keen eyesight. And so really it's God's describing those things that are scavengers, shall we say. Think about what these things eat and how they would eat. Even the actual eagle that we have today sometimes does some of this, but really this is, again, pointing to a larger version of a vulture. The ossifrage is the bearded vulture, meaning literally to break. And so you see the idea, something to do with the manner of either how it kills its victims, really dropping it from great heights to shatter its bones like the ossifrage would do, or being one that is truly just a scavenger. And so we see those descriptions. The phrase in verse 14 and 15, the vulture and the kite after his kind, the vulture and the kite after his kind, the raven after his kind. And so we see that this is inclusive of birds within that family that's mentioned. Thus, every kind of kite, or maybe better translated like the American Standard Version has it, falcon was unclean, and every kind of raven was unclean. In verses 16 through 18, there are a number of translations that take the owl that's in verse 16 and make it the ostrich. More correctly, probably is the owl, since this bird of prey seems to be indicated. The ostrich is not a bird of prey. And so we see the idea here. God is setting aside those that would be unclean. Verse 19, he gives a classification of the bat, and we're going to discuss this later on. We'll ask the question, how can the bat be included with the bird since the bat is a mammal? Well, just to give you a simple answer right now, does the bat fly? That's the answer. Again, God is talking about and trying to make it easy for a nation of somewhere near 2 million people who are out having to walk around for these coming 40 years as it's going to be, and they need to know what they can and cannot partake of. They don't need a big long thing that says, okay, you got to go determine this, determine that, determine this. God says basically for the birds, anything that flies, here's its rules. And so we see a description that's easy to handle. Verses 20 through down about verse 25. These are the fowls that creep, it says. So winged insects is what we're going to be talking about. The literal translation of those words for fowls that creep is swarming things, going upon all four. It's not to be taken absolutely literal, but insects that would be walking regularly and swarming. That's the key to it. So beginning at verse 20, going through 25, it says, all fowls that creep, going upon all four, shall be an abomination unto you. Yet these may ye eat of every flying creeping thing that goeth upon all four, which have legs above their feet, to leap withal upon the earth. Even these of them ye may eat, the locust after his kind, and the bald locust after his kind, and the beetle after his kind, and the grasshopper after his kind. But all other flying creeping things which have 4 feet shall be an abomination unto you. And for these ye shall be unclean. Whatsoever toucheth the carcass of them shall be unclean until the even. And whosoever beareth aught of the carcass of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until even. We see the picture here now. And there are places where some of these are great delicacies. Personally, don't bring me no chocolate-covered grasshoppers. They're not going to make it on my dietary list. But people can eat those. They were clean according to God for the Israelites. You see his picture is still giving just that great description. If it's something that maybe it flies, but it's designed to leap, much like the locust, the grasshopper, the beetle that's listed, those things could be used and could be eaten as clean. Verse 24 and 25 give the principle regarding contact with unclean winged insects that in the end extends to all unclean animals. Why would you not want to touch them? And why would you be unclean until even if you got around their carcass? Well, many of these things, if we just take it the simple way, carried disease. What were you to do if you came in contact with a carcass? Well, you go wash your clothes, you wash yourself, and you remain unclean until evening. In other words, giving it time to make sure that it was separated. It's something we ought to be able to understand in the current climate of our country with the COVID going around and the mask orders that are out. The idea of remaining separated when there's a chance it could be contagious to someone else. And the picture being, it's not only the physical that God's looking at, but think about when he uses the unclean and he's pointing to keep yourself clean, keep separated from those things. Spiritually, even more important. Looking at verses 26 through 28 now, we get some additional comments on four-footed animals. Where we began, God's coming back full circle, in other words. God started and said, here's the beast, the four-footed land animals. Here is what's in the waters. Here is that which is in the air. Here are the insects and other flying, creeping things. And then at verse 26, we pick up and go through verse 28. It says, the carcasses of every beast which divideth the hoof, and is not cloven-footed, nor cheweth the cud, are unclean unto you. Every one that toucheth them shall be unclean. So don't be touching the carcass. And whatsoever goeth upon his paws among all manner of beasts that go on all four, those are unclean unto you. Whoso touches their carcass shall be unclean until the even. And he that beareth the carcass of them shall wash his clothes, and be unclean until even. They are unclean unto you. Now, God's not saying you just leave the animal carcass laying out in the middle of the camp if it was somewhere like that. He makes provision for that because he says the one that beareth the carcass. Yes, there's times you're going to have to get rid of it. In general, don't touch these things. They're unclean unto you. If you have to, you're going to be unclean. But here's what you are to do. Bear the carcass, then you go wash your clothes, and you remain unclean till even. Why? Because they are unclean unto you. And so we see the picture of what to do with these animals. More on the swarming creatures now. As you begin verse 29, and really going all the way down to about verse 38. But we'll take it in smaller chunks for a moment. The first section of it, verses 29 through 31. These also shall be unclean unto you among the creeping things that creep upon the earth, the weasel and the mouse and the tortoise after his kind, and the ferret and the chameleon and the lizard and the snail and the mole. These are unclean to you among all that creep. Whatsoever doth touch them when they be dead shall be unclean until the even. And so you notice the idea. Again, don't be touching the dead weasel or mouse, and if you have to, you're going to be unclean till the even. Good reason for it. Beginning at verse 32 through 38, notice the pollution that's caused by it, or the result of these unclean swarming creatures. 32 through 38, where it says, and upon whatsoever any of them when they are dead doth fall, it shall be unclean, whether it be any vessel of wood or raiment or skin or sack, whatsoever vessel it be, wherein any work is done, it must be put into water, and it shall be unclean until even, so it shall be cleansed. And any earthen vessel whereinto any of them falleth, whatsoever is in it shall be unclean, and ye shall break it. Of all meat which may be eaten, that on which such water cometh shall be unclean, and all drink that may be drunk in every such vessel shall be unclean. And everything whereupon any part of their carcass falleth shall be unclean unto you. Nevertheless, a fountain or pit wherein there is plenty of water shall be clean, but that which toucheth their carcass shall be unclean. And if any part of their carcass fall upon any sowing seed which is to be sown, it shall be clean. But if any water be put upon the seed, and any part of their carcass fall thereon, it shall be unclean unto you. You see God giving the idea that an unclean animal would not only defile a person who had direct contact with the carcass, but it would cause whatever it touched to have a polluting effect, that it could be affected by it. What's done with it depends on what it was. You notice back in verse 32, if the dead doth fall and it be on a vessel of wood, or it be on raiment, your clothing, or skin, or sack, whatever vessel it be, wherein any work is done, it must be put into the water. It's got to be cleaned. And it's going to remain unclean till even, but it will be cleansed. You can wash it. But notice verse 33, the pottery, the earthen vessel, whatever it is unclean now, and it gets broken. You think about why. Wood has a tendency to be somewhat porous, but the kind of wood they're using was very hard wood and really didn't soak up a lot. And so it could be cleansed, it could be wiped off and cleansed. The earthen pots had the tendency to leach things out. And so if you put poisoned water into an earthen vessel, it would hold on to that poison. That's what's being described here. And so if it's pottery, break it. That's it. It's over. And so you see the idea. You get into the verses and God just makes it clear. When things happen, here's how you handle it. If it falls onto an oven or a range for pots, and you have to take care of it. It's broken down. But if it falls onto a fountain or a pit where there's plenty of water, well, then you have an unclean area and you take care of it. But the overall, that large amount of water is able to take care of cleaning what is the problem. And so we see the idea that God puts forth. Notice verses 39 and 40 now in contact with the carcasses of clean animals. We've been talking about the unclean and how they are affecting. But notice verses 39 and 40. And if any beast of which you may eat die, so it's a clean animal, he that toucheth the carcass thereof shall be unclean until the even. And he that eateth of the carcass of it shall wash his clothes and be unclean till even. He also that beareth the carcass of it shall wash his clothes and be unclean till even. And so if you had a clean animal that died naturally or was killed by another animal, its carcass was unclean. The instructions to it, you would be unclean just as the one who ate of that animal would be unclean by just touching it. Not that the carcass couldn't be handled, but there was a rule about what happened when you did. Verses 41 through 45, going to cover the other unclean swarming creatures. We get some more of these. Beginning at verse 41. Says, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth shall be an abomination. It shall not be eaten. Whatsoever goeth upon the belly, and whatsoever goeth upon all four, or whatsoever hath more feet among all creeping things that creep upon the earth, them ye shall not eat, for they are an abomination. Ye shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing that creepeth, neither shall ye make yourselves unclean with them, that ye should be defiled thereby. For I am the Lord your God. Ye shall therefore sanctify yourselves, and ye shall be holy, for I am holy. You see God giving the picture as we get into verse 44. Think 41 through 43, God provides that final group of swarming creatures. Things like snakes, worms, rats, reptiles, non-winged insects. They're unclean. They're an abomination. You don't eat them. The reason being, it goes back to God's trying to make them holy like he is holy. Looking at verse 44 and 45. For I am the Lord your God. Ye shall therefore sanctify yourselves. Set yourselves apart, in other words, and ye shall be holy, set apart. Why? For I am holy. Neither shall ye defile yourselves with any manner of creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. Verse 45, for I am the Lord that bringeth you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. Ye shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. Plain and simple, if God said it was unclean, it's unclean. If you become unclean, you're not holy. That's what God's looking at, and he wants men to be holy, purified, set apart to his will. And so he's bringing that out over and over. If you look at verses 46 and 47, we have the ending of the chapter, 46 and 47. This is the law of the beast and of the fowl and of every living creature that moveth in the waters and of every creature that creepeth upon the earth, to make a difference between the unclean and the clean, and between the beasts that may be eaten and the beasts that may not be eaten. God's given the rule, basically. God's laid it out for the Israelites. Did they understand and comprehend God's reasoning behind every instruction? Probably not. Many of us today would say, why did God tell the Israelites they couldn't eat swine? Bacon is so good. It's one of the primary food groups. How can you not have bacon? Well, plain and simple, if God had left that in place, the Christian today could not have bacon. Fortunately, God took that rule out of the way because I like my bacon. But we see that picture that God says, here is how it's to be done. And a dietary law would serve to give the Israelites the ability to discern between unclean and clean, and remind really on a daily basis, because how often does one eat in general? Every day. Here's a reminder, you're set apart to be different. You're set apart for the Lord. Again, Christians today aren't bound by the dietary laws, but we have a need to discern between unclean and clean. We are to be holy because God is holy, as it repeats in the New Testament. So we ought to be just like they were, looking at the thing to determine clean or unclean, as the case may be. That's where we'll go ahead and stop for this evening. We will pick up on Sunday with some questions concerning these very things. Let me go ahead and give you the idea of what we'll be covering on Sunday. We'll be looking at questions concerning, is the bat a bird or a mammal? Why? Well, in the simple reason is man's come up with his own classifications now, and the bat is not a bird, it's a mammal. How can it be included? Well, the simple answer, does it fly? We'll look at that a little closer. Does the rabbit chew the cud? We'll talk about more about that, because in the actual, if you could take it apart scientifically and look at it, there are men that are going to tell you it doesn't chew the cud. But if you ever watch a rabbit eat, it sure does look like it's chewing the cud. And so we'll look at those and then go into chapter 12 and talk about the purification after childbirth. Let's go to God again in prayer. Our God and Father in heaven, we are thankful for the time we've had, for your word that gives us the guidance and the thoughts that we ought to have as we move into the world. Father, we ask your forgiveness when we fall short on things that you have pointed for us to do or not to do. We ask that you give us time and opportunity that we might correct ourselves and be pleasing to you. We ask again your continued care, comfort, guidance as it comes through your process could be put away. We ask your providential care upon all those that may be affected at this time by the virus, that it will be what you will that happens, but that if possible, they could be healed and freed and normalcy can return. We ask all these things through your Son's name. Amen.